When the door creaked open and I saw my husband standing there, suitcase in one hand and grocery bag in the other, I froze, not because I was surprised to see him, but because I knew we had run out of time. The sounds of the shower were still echoing through the tiled hallway. I had left the bathroom just seconds ago, steam still clinging to my skin. I could smell the lavender soap in the air, feel the damp towel still in my hands. He wasn't supposed to be back until morning. That's what he'd said. That's what I believed. Or maybe that's what I wanted to believe. He looked at me, confused. His eyes trailed to the droplets on my arms, the slight flush in my cheeks. And then they moved toward the hallway, toward the closed bathroom door. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My mouth went dry. He didn't ask anything, not yet. Just looked. And that look, disbelief, pain, suspicion, all twisted into something unreadable, something that made my knees go weak. My chest tightened, and 1,000 words I might have said evaporated into the humid air. The phone in my pocket buzzed, and I knew without looking who it was. He heard it. He turned back to me, slower this time, and tilted his head. That was the moment I knew everything I had tried to suppress, to compartmentalize, to forget, it would all come out now. But he didn't know everything. Not yet. And even if I confessed, even if I told him every shameful detail, he would never understand why. Because 3 months ago, something shifted inside me. And once it shifted, there was no turning back. Let me tell you how it happened. But before I reveal the secret I've carried like a stone in my chest, tell me in the comments below where you're watching from, and answer one question. Have you ever had a secret you tried so hard to bury, only to watch it dig itself out at the worst possible time? We had just moved in. Boxes lined the hallway like misplaced pieces of a puzzle we hadn't figured out yet. My husband was busy with paperwork, muttering about utility bills and calling the plumber for the 3rd time that week. I stood by the kitchen window, stirring lukewarm coffee, watching nothing in particular. The house was beautiful, newer, larger, cleaner. Everything we had dreamed about in theory. But in practice, it felt empty. He was doing everything right. On paper. Paying the bills. Calling the movers. Asking if I wanted Thai or Mexican for dinner. But he didn't see me. Not really. Not the woman who stood next to him every morning, whose silence had shifted from thoughtful to suffocating. He didn't notice that I stopped wearing lipstick or that I hadn't touched him in weeks. Maybe he did notice, and just didn't want to ask why. The arrival of his nephew, the one from his sister's side, was announced casually. He's coming to help with the backyard. Just a few days, my husband said, halfway through an email. I nodded. Sure. I didn't even remember what he looked like, not clearly. I hadn't seen him since he was a teenager, all elbows and awkwardness. Now he was older, mid-20s maybe? I wasn't sure. He arrived in the afternoon, driving a dusty pickup truck and carrying a box of tools. When I opened the door, I paused. He had grown into himself. Confident in the quiet way some men are. A quick, genuine smile. The kind that reaches the eyes. Thanks for having me, he said, adjusting his backpack over one shoulder. Of course, I replied, my voice catching slightly. Come in. He smelled like sawdust and sun. I told myself it was just nostalgia, or hormones, or the shock of seeing someone so familiar and so changed. Nothing more. Dinner that night was awkward in the expected ways. My husband talked about the remodeling plans and the fence we'd need to repaint. The nephew, let's just call him he for now, nodded and smiled, contributing only when asked. I barely spoke. My mouth was dry, and I found myself drinking more wine than usual. I watched him. The way he listened, the way he leaned back in his chair, his long fingers wrapped around the glass. I told myself I was simply tired. That it was all in my head. Later, after the dishes were done and the men had moved outside to talk about lumber and gutters, I stood at the sink with my hands in soapy water and stared at my reflection in the window. I looked tired. Older. But there was something else there too. A flush in my cheeks. A pulse I hadn't noticed in a long time. When they came back in, my husband went straight to bed. He had an early meeting. I offered the guest room and fresh towels. He thanked me, eyes meeting mine for a split second longer than necessary. That night, I lay awake. I could hear the house settling, pipes groaning, the wind brushing against the windows. But beneath it all, I heard another sound. My own heartbeat. And it was louder than anything else. The next morning came too quickly. I tried to shake off the unease by keeping busy. Organizing shelves, unpacking books I hadn't read in years. My husband left for work early, leaving behind a note that said he'd be home late. I walked out to the garden with my coffee and found him already there, pulling weeds, shirt off, sun on his back. He looked up and smiled. Not a flirtatious smile. Just warm. Friendly. But it made something inside me flicker. I didn't hear you come out, I said. Didn't want to wake anyone. I'm already awake. He chuckled. Not surprised. You look like someone who doesn't sleep much. I raised an eyebrow. Is that supposed to be a compliment? He laughed. Maybe. The air between us changed. Not suddenly. Just slightly. Like a breeze shifting direction. I turned back toward the house, forcing myself not to look again. That afternoon, we went shopping for supplies. The hardware store was dull, gray, sterile, but his presence made it feel different. I let him drive, pretending I didn't notice how close our arms came in the small truck cab. He asked me about my favorite movies. I asked him about college. It was small talk, nothing dangerous. But everything in me was on high alert. My skin hummed under my sweater. When we returned, he touched my lower back while helping me out of the truck. Just briefly. Just polite. But I felt it for hours. My husband came home later than expected, exhausted and distracted. He kissed me on the cheek. I pretended it was enough. That night, I dreamed of nothing and everything all at once. I woke with a start and found myself reaching for a glass of water I didn't need. Outside, the garden waited. Inside, the air thickened. I knew what was coming. But I wasn't ready. The morning light bled slowly through the curtains, casting a pale gold shimmer across the wooden floor. I stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the yard where he was already moving. He worked efficiently, shirt clinging to his back in the early heat, bending to pick up paint cans we'd left there yesterday. There was something steady about his movements, unhurried, deliberate. He looked up at one point, not at me, but in my direction, shielding his eyes from the sun. I stepped back before he could see me staring. I poured coffee I didn't want and sat at the edge of the kitchen stool, my thoughts circling too fast to catch. The air inside the house felt too still, too quiet. My husband had left an hour ago, off to a meeting he'd been stressing over all week. He hadn't noticed that I hadn't slept. Or maybe he had, and didn't know how to ask. Or didn't care to. The front door opened with a creak. I startled, even though I'd been expecting it. He walked in, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm. Finished with the baseboards, he said casually, setting down his tools. I nodded. Do you want something cold? Water's fine. I reached for a glass, trying not to let my hands shake. As I turned back toward him, I noticed a fleck of paint on his jaw, white against the warm tone of his skin. Without thinking, I lifted my hand to point it out, but paused before touching him. "You've got some here," I said. He wiped the wrong side. I hesitated again. Then, slowly, I reached forward and brushed it away with my thumb. His skin was warm. Too warm. And for a second, just one, he didn't move. I pulled my hand back. He thanked me, voice tight. We painted the fence together that day, working side by side in the late morning sun. The air grew thicker, heavier, with every hour. We didn't talk much, just passed brushes and water bottles, occasionally shared a short comment about coverage or angles. But beneath that quiet, something else vibrated. Like a wire pulled too taut. At one point, I bent to rinse my hands in the bucket. He turned at the same time, and we bumped shoulders. I looked up. His face was so close I could feel his breath. Neither of us spoke. The seconds stretched, suspended between decision and denial. Then I turned away. We continued working as if nothing had happened, but I knew it had. My heartbeat wouldn't slow. My palms were damp, not just from water. My lips felt too aware of themselves, like they remembered a touch that hadn't yet happened. By noon, we moved inside. The sun was too much, and the hallway walls still needed primer. As I reached for the roller, he said something, some joke I didn't quite catch, but I laughed anyway. Too loud. Too light. I dropped the roller and it hit the floor with a dull thud. He bent down to pick it up at the same time I did. Our fingers touched. I felt my body stiffen, and before I could stop it, I looked into his eyes. And then, we kissed, It was sudden, like a gasp. Not gentle, not slow, but not rough either. Urgent. Confused. My hands gripped the edge of the bucket behind me for balance. His breath caught. And just as quickly, I pulled back. The silence afterward was worse than the kiss. I walked to the sink, washed my hands, and dried them carefully. Each movement felt forced, mechanical. He stood in the middle of the room, uncertain. I didn't look at him when I spoke. "That can't happen again." He didn't answer. Just nodded once and walked out. I sat alone at the kitchen table, heart pounding in my ears. My body trembled, not from fear or regret, but from the terrifying clarity of what had just shifted inside me. Something real. Something I hadn't felt in years. That night, my husband returned home exhausted. He kissed my forehead and asked what we'd gotten done. I told him the hallway was nearly finished. He smiled, proud, and poured himself a drink. I watched him from across the room. I saw the man I'd built a life with, his routines, his steadiness, his good intentions. But I also saw the gaps. The pauses. The spaces where connection should have been. In bed, I turned my back to him and stared at the ceiling for hours. I thought of the kiss. The heat of it. The mistake of it. The inevitability of it. The next morning, I dressed with more care than usual. A fitted blouse. Lip gloss I hadn't touched in months. He didn't comment, just said he'd be late coming home. Outside, the paintbrushes waited. So did the memory of what I'd let happen. And the question of what would happen next. I woke up to the sound of birds outside the window and a strange tightness in my chest that I couldn't immediately name. The sun filtered softly through the blinds, casting a familiar warm glow on the hardwood floor. Everything looked the same, yet I didn't feel the same. My body still remembered what had happened the day before, what I had allowed to happen. What I hadn't stopped. What I had wanted. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled like coffee. I could hear him moving around before I even reached the bottom step. I hesitated, hand resting on the banister, unsure if I was ready to face him. But there was no more room for avoidance. We were both still here. The house wasn't big enough to hide in. He was standing at the counter, pouring water into the kettle. He looked over his shoulder and nodded in greeting, as if nothing had changed. I returned the nod, grateful and unsettled by the pretense. The silence between us wasn't cold, it was cautious, as if words might ignite something neither of us was ready for. I sat at the kitchen table and pulled a folded list from my robe pocket. It was full of tasks I'd written the night before, a desperate attempt to restore order, replace hallway light bulb, return extra curtain rods, paint the last corner of the living room. He poured 2 cups and slid one toward me without a word. I murmured a thanks and took a sip, letting the warmth distract me. For a few minutes, we said nothing. The weight of yesterday's moment sat between us like a third presence. After breakfast, my husband called. He was already at his meeting and just checking in. I kept my voice steady, cheerful even. I asked about the documents he was presenting, told him the house was quiet. I didn't mention the paint. I didn't mention anything that mattered. He said he might not be home until late. I told him to take his time. When I hung up, I leaned against the counter for a long time. The house felt too quiet again. I wanted noise, not music, not voices. Just distraction. Anything to stop my thoughts from circling the drain they were heading toward. I grabbed the curtain rods from the storage room and called out that I was heading to the hardware store. He offered to come. I told him that wasn't necessary. He insisted. I hesitated, then agreed. What else could I do? The drive into town was uneventful at first. We rode in silence, the hum of the engine filling the space between us. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to focus on stop signs and traffic lights. Trying not to feel how close his arm was on the armrest. Trying not to remember the way his breath had felt the day before, just inches from mine. Halfway there, he reached for the radio and turned it down slightly. I glanced over, unsure if he was about to speak. But he didn't. He just stared out the window, one hand tapping absently on his knee. His profile was calm. There was no trace of confusion or guilt. Just quiet awareness. I envied that. At the store, we walked the aisles with a practiced efficiency. I found the bulbs we needed. He compared curtain hooks, debating which ones were sturdier. We spoke only when necessary. But even those words were coded in something unspoken. Something more dangerous than silence. On our way to checkout, a woman stopped us. She looked about my age, maybe slightly younger. She smiled and said she remembered me from the local book club, years ago. I pretended to remember her. Then she glanced at him and asked, "Your son?" My breath caught, and I laughed a little too quickly. My husband's nephew. He's helping with renovations. She nodded politely, but I saw something flicker behind her eyes, with curiosity, maybe even suspicion. She said goodbye, and we walked away, neither of us commenting on it. Back in the car, I turned on the air conditioner and leaned my head back against the seat. My heart hadn't slowed since we left the store. I realized how tightly I'd been gripping the steering wheel. When we pulled into the driveway, I sat for a moment longer, not moving. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I nodded without looking at him. "Just tired." Inside, I busied myself with organizing the new supplies, pretending to be focused, pretending not to feel his presence behind me. He lingered in the hallway for a while, then went back outside to continue the yard work. I watched from the window for a minute before turning away. Later that afternoon, I went out to check on him. The heat had become intense. He was kneeling near the hedge, sweat glistening on his arms. I handed him a bottle of water. Our fingers brushed, and we both froze. I pulled my hand back quickly and said nothing. He took the bottle, nodded once, and drank. The tension was unbearable, thick as humidity. I turned and went back inside. I stayed in the kitchen for the rest of the afternoon, cleaning things that didn't need cleaning, folding towels that were already folded. I kept moving so I wouldn't think. So I wouldn't feel. So I wouldn't remember. By the time my husband called again, it was nearing 7. He was finishing dinner with colleagues and heading back soon. He asked if everything was all right. I said yes. I lied. After the call, I stepped into the living room and found him standing there, looking at the half-painted wall. He didn't speak at first. Then he said, "I can finish this tonight." "You don't have to." "I want to." I didn't reply. I watched him reach for the roller and start painting, long, even strokes, methodical and steady. I turned away before I said something I couldn't take back. I went upstairs, drew a bath, and sat in silence. I sank beneath the surface, listening to the dull rush in my ears. When I came out, the house was quieter than before. I passed the guest room, his room, and paused. The door was closed. A light flickered underneath. I stood there for a moment too long. Then I walked away. That night, I lay beside my husband, who had come home while I was in the bath. He was asleep already, breathing soft and slow. I stared at the ceiling, heart aching with a weight I couldn't name. Everything had changed. But nothing had been said. And I didn't know how long that could last. The following morning arrived under a heavy sky, low and gray, as if the air itself had thickened with the weight of what hadn't been said. I stood at the back door, coffee in hand, watching the clouds move slowly above the yard. The garden looked untouched, despite all the hours we had spent trying to make it new. The freshly painted fence was the only sign that anything had changed. And still, it didn't feel like enough. My husband had left early again. Another meeting, another rushed kiss on the forehead. I nodded when he said he'd be home late. That had become our rhythm, polite, efficient, distant. Words passed between us like receipts, necessary, but meaningless. After the door closed behind him, the house returned to its silence. I stayed near the window, listening to the distant whir of a lawnmower from a neighboring yard. Eventually, I turned and walked toward the laundry room. There was always something to do. And today, I needed something that would make me feel useful, even if only for an hour. I carried a basket of damp clothes out into the backyard and began hanging them along the line. The sky had cleared slightly, the breeze soft against my neck. I moved slowly, pin by pin, cloth by cloth, my mind elsewhere. I didn't hear him approach until his voice broke the quiet. "Didn't think people still did this," he said behind me. I turned. He stood just beyond the steps, hands in his pockets, sweat on his collarbone from working the soil. He smiled, not wide, but soft, like a gesture meant only for me. "It dries better this way," I answered. He nodded, walking over to help without another word. He picked up a towel from the basket and began clipping it beside mine. I didn't stop him. The space between us was measured in inches, yet felt like a chasm I didn't know how to cross, or escape. We worked like that for a while. Quiet, in tandem, with no acknowledgement of what still lingered in the air. It wasn't until the last sheet fluttered into place that something shifted. A gust of wind kicked up, strong enough to knock over the watering can by the porch. As I reached to steady it, the sprinklers sprang to life with a sudden hiss, catching me off guard. A full arc of cold water shot from the ground, soaking the hem of my dress. I gasped, taking a step back, but not quickly enough. Within seconds, my legs and waist were drenched. I laughed, sharp and involuntary. Not because it was funny, but because the absurdity of it cracked through my tension like lightning. I looked down at my soaked front, the fabric clinging to my skin, transparent in patches. I tried to tug the dress away from my body, but it was too late. He didn't laugh. He stared. Not inappropriately. Not even with desire. Just stillness. His eyes traced the outline of my body, then met mine, as if seeing something he wasn't sure he was allowed to witness. I should have turned away. I should have run inside and changed. But I stood there, breathing hard, my hands slightly raised in surrender to the moment. His expression didn't change. But something in the air did. I turned and walked past him, leaving a trail of wet footprints on the wooden steps. Inside, I moved quickly to the bathroom, closing the door behind me. I pressed my back to the wall and tried to catch my breath. The reflection in the mirror stopped me. My face was flushed, eyes wide, hair damp at the ends. I didn't look like a woman ashamed. I looked alive. I changed into dry clothes and returned to the kitchen, where I pretended to check my grocery list. I stood there longer than necessary, as if logic could erase whatever had passed between us. When he came back in, his shirt clung to his body in patches from his own brush with the sprinklers. He didn't say anything. Just grabbed a towel and dried his hands. "I'll be out front if you need me," he said quietly. I nodded, still not meeting his eyes. The afternoon dragged. I tried to busy myself with cleaning the upstairs bathroom, scrubbing tiles that didn't need scrubbing. I wiped mirrors, rearranged towels, anything to avoid the thoughts that crowded my head. Around 4, I went back downstairs and found him sitting on the porch steps, sipping from a glass of water. He looked up as I approached and offered a small nod, then gestured toward the empty space beside him. I sat without a word. The street was quiet. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the lawn. A neighbor's dog barked in the distance. Somewhere, a lawnmower hummed. But all I could hear was my heartbeat, slow and deliberate. "Are you okay?" he asked finally. I didn't answer right away. I took a breath, then another. "I don't know," I admitted. He didn't press. Just sat beside me in silence, watching the light change. That evening, my husband returned with takeout and a headache. He kissed my cheek, handed me the bag, and collapsed onto the couch. I heated the food, set the table, poured his favorite drink. He thanked me. Ate in silence. Then went upstairs to shower. When I passed the guest room later, the door was slightly ajar. I could hear the faint sound of drawers closing, soft footsteps across the floor. I paused but didn't enter. Instead, I stood there, listening to the quiet movements of someone I could no longer pretend was just a guest. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about wet footprints and eyes that didn't look away. I didn't know what I wanted. But I knew what I had done. I had stood still when I should have walked away. I had let a moment expand into something else. And I didn't know if it could still be undone. The weekend crept in quietly, as if it too was unsure of its place. There was no particular celebration, no shift in tone, just the slow transformation of hours folding into each other. My husband was scheduled to be away most of Saturday for a company retreat. He told me over coffee, with his phone in one hand and his eyes half on his inbox. "I'll probably be back late." "Don't wait up," he said. I nodded, pretending not to notice the relief blooming somewhere deep inside me. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table, tracing the rim of my cup with a fingertip. The silence was a presence now, not just an absence. It wasn't peaceful, it was thick, uncomfortable, filled with all the things I couldn't name. Outside, the sky was bright. The grass shimmered under the sunlight, freshly cut, still damp from the morning dew. I could hear him moving in the shed, rearranging tools or looking for something, though what exactly, I didn't know. I didn't have a plan. That was the most terrifying part. There was no blueprint, no script I was following. I simply existed in the middle of something that had started small but now loomed larger than I had anticipated. What had begun as a glance had grown into a weight, pulling everything out of balance. I found him an hour later in the guest bedroom, organizing extension cords and checking a portable fan that had been making strange noises. I hovered by the doorway for a moment before speaking. "I was thinking we could finish the bedroom walls today," I said. My voice sounded too even. Too rehearsed. He looked up and nodded once. "Sure. We've got enough paint left." We started in the late morning. It was a slow process, not because the work was difficult, but because we couldn't seem to settle into a rhythm. Our hands reached for the same roller. Our arms brushed as we moved past each other. The room wasn't big enough for all the space we tried to keep between us. The silence between us now was heavier than ever. Not awkward, exactly, just expectant. Like something inevitable was approaching, and we were both pretending not to see it. At one point, I stood on a small stool to reach the top corners. He was holding it steady from behind. I felt the warmth of his hand through the thin fabric of my skirt as it brushed against the side of my leg. I paused, holding the brush midair. We didn't speak. I climbed down slowly, and when I turned to face him, he didn't look away. There was something in his eyes, uncertainty, restraint, and something else I couldn't quite name. I wanted to look away. I wanted to say something neutral, something safe. But nothing came. We stood there, inches apart, and the world seemed to hold its breath. We kissed. Not with urgency. Not like before. This one was slower. Heavier. Acknowledging rather than initiating. It felt like the answer to a question we'd both been afraid to ask. I stepped back first. My heart was pounding, my hands trembling, and yet I couldn't stop staring at him. Neither of us said a word. We didn't need to. Everything had already been said in the silence. I picked up the paint roller and turned back to the wall. He joined me moments later, and we worked in silence once again. But this time, it wasn't tension that filled the space between us. It was something quieter. Something far more dangerous. Later, I found myself in the laundry room folding towels I had already folded yesterday. The repetition calmed me, gave my hands something to do while my mind raced in circles. I tried to make sense of what had happened, of what was happening. I wasn't someone who made reckless decisions. My life was carefully constructed, each part built with intention. I had a home, a husband, a routine. I didn't take risks. I didn't break rules. And yet, here I was, standing in the middle of a mess of my own making. When I returned to the hallway, I saw him coming out of the bathroom, hair damp from a quick shower, shirt clinging to his chest. He moved past me with a quiet nod, and I turned quickly into the living room, pretending to look for something I'd misplaced. I sat on the couch, trying to breathe evenly, to calm the storm inside me. But it was no use. The doorbell rang unexpectedly. I jumped, heart leaping to my throat. He appeared beside me in seconds, both of us startled by the intrusion. I peeked through the curtain and saw a woman standing on the porch, holding a clipboard and wearing a smile that suggested she had no idea she was walking into a carefully concealed collapse. She was from the electric company, surveying local usage for an efficiency program. I answered her questions as best I could, voice steady, face composed. He stayed in the background, quiet, alert, watching. When she left, the silence returned, almost as if we had both been holding it at bay together. We finished the wall just before sunset. The room looked cleaner, brighter, more finished. It felt wrong somehow, that something could be so neat when everything else inside me was unraveling. I thanked him for his help. He nodded, said he'd take care of the rollers. I walked to the kitchen and stood by the sink, staring out the window into the now dark yard. A breeze moved the branches gently, and I could see the moon peeking through the leaves. I didn't hear him come in, but I felt him standing behind me. For a moment, I considered turning around. Saying something. Anything. But I didn't. Instead, I walked away. That night, my husband returned. He looked tired, shoulders slumped, briefcase dangling from one hand. I met him at the door, kissed him lightly, and took the bag from his hand. He asked how the painting had gone. I told him it was finished. He smiled, pleased. He didn't ask for more details. We ate dinner in the living room, watching a show we'd already seen. He laughed at the same parts. I smiled at the same parts. It was all familiar. All safe. But as I lay in bed later, listening to his breathing beside me, I knew that something had shifted too far to return. The kiss had not just been an impulse. It had been a decision. Maybe not a conscious one, but a decision nonetheless. And even though I didn't know what would come next, I knew I couldn't undo what had already begun. The morning came with the stillness of something unresolved. I opened my eyes to the faint hum of birds outside the window and the dull ache in my chest that had become all too familiar. My husband was already gone, his side of the bed cold and undisturbed. He had left a note on the dresser, the usual polite scribble, "Meeting ran late. Let's try to have dinner together tonight." I stood in the quiet, brushing my fingers along the edge of the paper. There was no blame in his handwriting, no suspicion, no tension. Just routine. And that, perhaps, was the most unbearable part. He was still holding on to the life we had built, while I was slipping through its cracks like water between floorboards. Downstairs, the house was warm with morning light. I made coffee and drank it standing up, leaning against the counter like I was waiting for something to begin, or end. Every sound felt magnified, the drip of the faucet, the ticking of the clock, the distant rustle of leaves beyond the window. He entered the kitchen a few minutes later, rubbing his neck as if trying to shake off a restless night. We exchanged nods, no words. There was a shared understanding now, unspoken and fragile. We had crossed too many lines to pretend we hadn't, yet no one seemed willing to name it. And maybe that made it worse. "I'm finishing up the side wall today," he said quietly. I nodded, wiping my hands on a towel. "I'll help after breakfast." We didn't mention what had happened. Not the brushes of hands, not the glances, not the kisses. Everything we had done lingered between us like a scent we couldn't scrub from the air. By mid-morning, we were outside again, tools spread out across the grass. The sun was already pressing down on our backs, and the humidity made every movement feel heavier than it should. We worked in parallel, wordless, the rhythm of our efforts a poor disguise for the turmoil beneath. At one point, he stood to stretch, and I found myself watching the way his shoulder blades moved beneath his shirt. I caught myself and looked away. But the heat on my neck lingered. I needed to get out of the house. To move. To breathe. "I'm going to the market," I said suddenly, wiping my hands on a rag. "We're low on a few things." He looked up but didn't argue. "Want help carrying?" "No. It's fine." I left without waiting for a reply. The drive into town felt strange, both liberating and terrifying. I rolled down the windows, letting the wind cut through the haze inside my head. The market was busy with weekend errands, people moving between stalls with lists and canvas bags, completely unaware of the chaos unraveling inside me. I walked through the aisles slowly, picking up fruit I didn't need and comparing labels with forced interest. Everything around me was normal. Too normal. I felt like a ghost in someone else's life. Near the dairy section, a woman I vaguely recognized from the neighborhood approached me with a smile. She asked how the renovations were going. I forced a smile and answered politely. She mentioned seeing my husband's nephew outside often, how nice it was to have help like that. I nodded, thanking her for the kind words, and turned away before she could say more. The air felt tight again, pressing in around my ribs. I left the store with only half of what I'd planned to buy. When I returned home, he was still outside, painting the edge of the window frame with measured care. I set the bags down on the counter and unpacked in silence. My hands moved automatically, placing each item where it belonged. But inside, everything felt misplaced. Later, we found ourselves working in the same room again. The front hallway needed touch-ups where the paint had dried unevenly. We stood side by side, moving brushes along the wall, careful not to touch. There was a moment when I stepped back to examine a corner and bumped into him. I muttered an apology, but he didn't move. His presence was steady behind me, unmoving, and suddenly the room felt too small again. I turned around slowly. His eyes met mine with quiet restraint. Neither of us said anything. We didn't need to. The electricity between us had grown too familiar to ignore. But I stepped back this time. "We should finish before dinner," I said, my voice low. He nodded, returning to the wall. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. We finished the hallway, packed away the brushes, and cleaned up the drop cloths without another incident. But the silence was louder than ever. That evening, my husband came home earlier than usual. He brought takeout, just like he had last week, and insisted we eat together on the porch. We sat under the fading sky, listening to the cicadas and the occasional passing car. He asked about the renovations, complimented how clean the lines looked along the trim. I smiled, thanked him, tried to keep the conversation light. At one point, he reached for my hand. I didn't pull away, but I didn't tighten my grip either. I let it rest there, motionless, while my eyes fixed on the horizon. After dinner, we watched the news in the living room. The voices from the television echoed in the space between us. I laughed at something I didn't hear. He nodded at a story I didn't follow. We were two people playing the part of a life we used to live. When he went upstairs to shower, I stayed behind to wash the dishes. I stood at the sink long after the last plate was dry, staring out the window into the darkness. The reflection of my face in the glass looked unfamiliar. Tired. Not from work, but from pretending. I went to bed before he came out of the bathroom. I lay on my side, facing the wall, listening to the soft creak of floorboards, the sound of drawers opening and closing, the quiet sigh of the mattress as he settled beside me. He whispered good night. I whispered it back. But I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Because no matter how still I lay, the truth inside me refused to rest. I woke to the soft patter of rain against the windows, a quiet rhythm that filled the room with an unexpected calm. It was still early, the light outside was pale and diffused, the kind of light that made the world feel suspended in a moment of indecision. My husband's side of the bed was empty, though I could hear the faint clink of dishes downstairs. He must have woken before me, moving through the morning with his usual quiet efficiency. I lay still for a few minutes, my body wrapped in warmth, but my mind already racing. Today felt heavier than the others, though I couldn't explain why. There was no planned event, no obligation, no pressing errand to run. And yet, a weight settled low in my chest, insistent and unrelenting. When I finally came down, he was at the kitchen table with his laptop open, a mug of coffee half full beside him. He looked up and smiled faintly, the same smile he always wore before diving into work. We exchanged a few words. How did you sleep? Do you want coffee? Do we still have milk? I responded automatically, my voice a murmur that barely reached the edges of the room. We shared breakfast in silence, not out of tension, but habit. He spoke briefly about a client call scheduled for the afternoon and mentioned something about a broken latch on the shed door. I listened, nodding at the appropriate times, but my mind was elsewhere. Or rather, nowhere. Floating in a gray space between decision and avoidance. When he left for the office, I stood at the doorway, watching his car pull out of the driveway. As soon as the sound of the engine faded, the silence returned, thicker than before. I closed the door and leaned against it for a long moment, the cold wood pressing into my back like a reminder. He was still here, upstairs, I assumed, though I hadn't seen him yet. We hadn't spoken since yesterday. Not directly. We had coexisted in the same house, breathing the same air, but carefully navigating around the growing fracture between us. It was becoming harder to ignore, even harder to justify. I spent the first part of the morning cleaning the upstairs hallway, wiping down baseboards that didn't need it, organizing a linen closet that hadn't been touched since the move. The physical act of moving kept the stillness at bay, gave shape to the hours that might otherwise blur together. Sometime around noon, I stepped outside to the back garden. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, just enough to leave the grass slick and the leaves heavy with moisture. I walked carefully, my shoes sinking slightly into the softened earth. He was there, near the side of the house, adjusting a section of gutter that had come loose in the wind. He looked up when he heard me approach, offering a silent nod of acknowledgement. I returned it, my hands deep in the pockets of my cardigan. We didn't speak, not right away. He continued working, and I watched. It struck me how routine this had all become, our silence, our proximity, the unspoken current that passed between us like static in the air. There was no drama, no declarations. Just tension, ever present, as if we were caught in a slow-moving storm neither of us could name. I thought it might leak, he said eventually, gesturing to the gutter. His voice was calm, casual, like we were still just two people maintaining a house. You're probably right, I replied, my voice low. Another pause. You okay? He asked, not looking at me. I considered lying, brushing it off with a tired smile and a soft yes. But the truth hung too heavily between us to pretend. I don't know, I said finally. He nodded, as if that was the answer he expected. Or the only one that could be given. Later, I made lunch and left a plate for him on the counter. I didn't wait to see if he ate it. Instead, I took mine to the living room, sat by the window, and watched the trees sway under the lingering weight of rain. The day passed like that, wordless, measured in small gestures and long silences. By early evening, my husband called. He'd be staying late again, some unexpected delay with a proposal he needed to review. I told him not to worry. He apologized, said he'd make it up to me. I said it was fine. I wasn't sure either of us believed our own lines anymore. With the house still quiet, I decided to finish the last bit of work in the guest bathroom. It was one of those tasks I had been putting off, a loose drawer, a missing tile. Something simple, something tangible. I gathered the tools and supplies and made my way upstairs. The bathroom was dim, the overhead light flickering slightly. I knelt near the vanity, focused on fitting the tile back into place. My hands moved steadily, muscle memory guiding each step. I didn't hear him approach until he was beside me, holding the flashlight steady without being asked. For a moment, I kept my eyes on the tile. Then I sat back on my heels and looked at him. He held my gaze quietly, something unspoken passing between us again. I stood slowly, brushing dust from my knees. He stepped aside to let me pass, but we were too close. Our shoulders touched. My breath caught, and I froze. Neither of us moved. The hallway behind us was still. The rain had stopped. I should go check the porch light, he said suddenly. I stepped back, and he walked away. I remained in the bathroom for a while longer, even after the task was finished. I sat on the edge of the tub, letting my thoughts circle without form. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I just sat there, holding on to the echo of something that hadn't happened but almost did. When I finally came back downstairs, the lights were on and the kettle was whistling. He had made tea, 2 mugs. One already poured, waiting on the table. I didn't ask who it was for. I simply picked it up and sat across from him. We drank in silence. When the clock struck 9, he stood. "Long day," he said. I nodded. "Yeah." He went to his room, and I went to mine. That night, I lay in the dark, listening to the stillness of the house. Every sound, the creak of wood, the sigh of wind outside, felt amplified. I stared at the ceiling, tracing patterns in the shadows. I knew what I had done. I knew what I hadn't done. And both truths pressed against me with equal weight. The day started without warning. I didn't wake slowly, drifting out of sleep. I opened my eyes as if summoned, a jolt of awareness pulling me from the depths. The ceiling above me was still cast in shadows, the first hints of morning light just beginning to trace the outlines of the room. I lay there for several long moments, listening. No sounds from downstairs. No movement in the hallway. Just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling into itself. I turned toward the empty side of the bed. My husband had left early again, a note placed on the pillow like always. I didn't read it right away. I stared at the folded paper as though it might change if I gave it enough time. Eventually, I reached for it and unfolded it with fingers that felt foreign. It was short, practical, kind, an apology for not being home last night, a promise of dinner together tonight. He asked if I could remind him to check the water heater. I placed the note back on the nightstand and sat on the edge of the bed, feet pressed to the cold floor. My mind was oddly still. No spinning thoughts, no rehearsed excuses or imagined futures. Just a hollow quiet that filled me from the inside out. Downstairs, I moved through the kitchen in a series of habitual gestures, boiling water, preparing toast, standing by the window as the kettle hissed behind me. Outside, the sky was a heavy gray, the kind that made everything seem muted. Even the trees looked tired. He entered the kitchen silently, like he always did. I didn't hear the creak of the stairs or the soft tread of his shoes across the hallway. One moment I was alone, and the next, he was there, reaching for a glass. I looked at him briefly, then away. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been avoided. The house felt too clean, too curated. Each item in its place, every corner wiped down and organized. It was the kind of order that revealed the chaos hiding beneath. We had worked so hard to make the house look perfect. But perfection, I was learning, had very little to do with peace. Later that morning, I decided to finish sorting the boxes in the attic. It had become a sort of ritual, these small tasks that allowed me to stay busy without thinking too deeply. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step a reminder of everything that had built up to this moment. The attic smelled of dust and old wood. The air was thick, warm, and still. I knelt by a half-opened box filled with winter coats and scarves we hadn't touched in years. I folded them carefully, one by one, placing them into a new bin. My hands moved with deliberate purpose, but my thoughts drifted. How did I get here? Not physically, not into this house or this attic or this moment. But into the space inside me that now felt so unrecognizable. I thought I had known myself. I thought I had made peace with the life I had chosen. And yet, each passing day made it harder to pretend that I hadn't quietly stepped away from myself. By the time I finished reorganizing, it was early afternoon. The light had changed, growing sharper, more golden. I wiped my hands on my jeans and descended the stairs, pausing on the landing when I heard footsteps below. He was in the living room, adjusting a crooked picture frame. I watched him for a moment from the hallway. His movements were calm, focused, as though tending to the house might fix something else entirely. I stepped into the room slowly, unsure if I was interrupting or simply existing alongside him. He turned, surprised but not startled. Our eyes met briefly before he looked away. "There's a small crack near the baseboard," he said. "I was going to patch it." I nodded. "Do you need anything?" "No. I've got it." I lingered for a moment longer, then left him to his work. Back in the kitchen, I started preparing dinner earlier than usual. I wasn't sure if my husband would be home on time or if the plan would change again, but I needed something to anchor myself. Chopping vegetables, stirring sauce, seasoning meat, each step helped ground me in something real. The scent filled the house slowly, seeping into the walls, the furniture, the silence. By the time the sun had dipped below the horizon, the table was set. The light overhead was soft, the wine glasses already filled. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, listening for the sound of tires on gravel. He came home later than he'd hoped, as expected. He entered with an apology, a distracted kiss on my cheek, and a compliment about how good everything smelled. I smiled, thanked him, handed him a plate. We sat across from each other, the conversation light and easy. Work, the weather, a funny email from his colleague. Nothing personal. Nothing deep. When dinner was over, I cleared the plates while he answered an email. He offered to help, but I waved him off, grateful for the quiet. As I stood at the sink, the water running warm over my hands, I felt more than heard someone step behind me. He stood there for a few seconds, close but not touching. I didn't turn around. I stared at the soapy dishes, my chest tight with unspoken weight. "I should head upstairs," he said finally. "Long day." I nodded. "Good night." When he left, I turned off the faucet and leaned forward, hands braced on the counter. My reflection in the darkened window stared back, tired, older, but still somehow searching. Later that night, I passed by the guest room on my way to get a glass of water. His door was closed. A thin strip of light bled out from the gap beneath. I paused there, just for a moment, and then moved on. Back in bed, my husband slept soundly beside me. His breathing was even, his body turned away. I lay on my back, eyes open, heart restless. The weight of what hadn't happened was just as heavy as the weight of what had. And somehow, I knew we were getting closer to something, though I still didn't know whether it would be an ending or a beginning. The morning broke with a strange brightness, a sharp contrast to the heaviness in my chest. The sky outside was clear, as if scrubbed clean overnight, and the air carried the early promise of spring. The kind of day that might have once lifted my mood, made me open the windows and put on music while I folded laundry or watered plants. But now, the light felt almost cruel in its indifference. It had no regard for what was unraveling inside this house. I moved through the kitchen like a shadow, quiet and deliberate. The coffee machine sputtered to life as I wiped down a countertop that didn't need cleaning. My hands needed something to do. My thoughts had begun to pile up again, pushing against the edges of my calm like floodwater behind a dam. He passed through the hallway a few minutes later. We exchanged nothing but a glance. I didn't trust myself to speak. There was too much sitting just beneath the surface, and I wasn't sure what might break free if I gave it voice. My husband came down shortly after. He looked well-rested, unusually cheerful for a midweek morning. He kissed my cheek as he reached for his coffee, commenting on the clear weather and how maybe today he could finally take a proper break. "I might finish early," he said between sips. "We could take a walk, maybe dinner in the garden?" I smiled and agreed, though I felt the smile strain against my face. The garden. The place where all of this had started to unravel. Where the sun had turned too warm, where glances had lingered too long, and where I had failed to turn away. After he left, the silence returned with a weight that seemed heavier than before. I stood at the kitchen sink, staring at the trees beyond the window. They swayed gently, their branches calm, unaware. I envied that calm. The rest of the morning passed uneventfully. I busied myself with minor tasks, changing the bedsheets, wiping down cabinet doors, organizing a drawer filled with tangled chargers and pens that no longer worked. Every movement felt like an attempt to restore order, not to the house, but to something deeper inside me. By early afternoon, I had exhausted the list of things to fix. He was out back, working on the final piece of trim around the deck. I watched him through the window for a moment before stepping outside with a tray, water, towels, a small container of almonds he liked to snack on. A peace offering, maybe. Or just an excuse to close the distance. He looked up as I approached and offered a quiet thank you. His face was flushed from the sun, his shirt darkened with sweat around the collar. I set the tray down on the edge of the deck and sat nearby, not too close, but not far either. We sat in silence, listening to the faint buzz of insects, the low hum of a lawnmower in the distance. The light shifted slowly, shadows stretching across the boards beneath us. "It looks good," I said finally, nodding toward the railing. He shrugged. "Almost done. After this, what will you work on?" He glanced at me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Not sure. Guess I'll know when the time comes." There was no accusation in his voice. No hint of pressure. Just a statement, floating between us like a loose thread. I nodded and looked away. Later that afternoon, my husband called. He was on his way home earlier than expected, just as he'd promised. He sounded light, upbeat. I told him I'd get dinner started. He said he'd pick up wine on the way. I hung up the phone and stood in the middle of the kitchen, the receiver still warm in my hand. For a moment, I didn't move. I just stood there, heart thudding too fast, too loud. I heard the shower turn on upstairs. The sound of water rushing through the pipes filled the quiet. I didn't mean to move toward it, but I did, slowly, step by step, as if pulled by something beyond thought. At the top of the stairs, I hesitated. The door to the bathroom was partially open, steam curling out into the hallway like smoke. The light inside was bright, almost golden. I took one step forward. Behind me, I heard the unmistakable sound of the front door unlocking. Time froze. The moment shattered. I turned just as my husband stepped inside, one arm full of grocery bags, the other balancing a bottle of wine. He looked up, surprised to see me at the top of the stairs. His gaze flicked past me, toward the bathroom. His brows drew together, just slightly. "Hey," he said. "Didn't expect to see you up there." I cleared my throat, forcing my voice to stay even. "Just grabbing some towels," I said. He nodded slowly, stepping further into the house. The front door clicked closed behind him. I descended the stairs with a folded towel clutched in my hands, though I had no memory of picking it up. I met him in the kitchen, and we began unpacking the groceries side by side, our conversation light and familiar. He talked about his afternoon, about traffic on the highway, about how the cashier at the store had made a joke that caught him off guard. I smiled where I needed to, laughed softly at the right moment. My hands moved without instruction, sorting vegetables, opening a bag of rice, measuring oil into a pan. Behind the noise of our conversation, the sound of water upstairs continued, steady and echoing. Eventually, it stopped. The quiet that followed felt heavier than the sound itself. I glanced toward the stairs, then back at my husband. He was looking through the mail, thumbing through a stack of envelopes like nothing had changed. Maybe nothing had. Or maybe everything had, and we were all just pretending not to notice. When dinner was ready, we ate outside. The evening air was cool, the sky painted with streaks of fading gold and soft blue. We talked about the garden, about repainting the shed, about maybe taking a weekend trip somewhere once things settled. I smiled, nodded, answered. I don't remember what I ate. Afterward, I cleared the plates and washed the dishes slowly, watching the water swirl down the drain. The house behind me was calm, peaceful, quiet. But inside, something had shifted. Something irreversible. And I didn't know how much longer I could carry it. The night passed slowly, each hour dragging behind the last like a long shadow. I lay awake long after the house had fallen into silence, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, my body still and cold under the sheets. My husband slept beside me, his breathing steady, untroubled. I listened to each rise and fall of his chest, wondering how it was possible to be so close and feel so far away. I thought of the towel in my hand, the open bathroom door, the water on the floor, the sound of footsteps at the top of the stairs. I thought of how I had turned just in time, how nothing had been said, but everything had been understood. Not in words, not in gestures, but in the silence that had followed. At some point, I drifted into a restless sleep, filled with fragments of memory and sensation. I woke before dawn, disoriented, heart racing, the pillow beneath me damp. The air was heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I slipped out of bed and moved through the house on quiet feet. I didn't turn on any lights. The kitchen was dim, only the faintest light from the window casting soft shadows on the walls. I stood by the sink for a long time, watching the horizon begin to shift from black to blue. By the time the sun rose, I had already showered, dressed, and brewed a pot of coffee. I set out 3 cups. One for each of us. Not knowing who would take which. Not knowing what would be said, if anything at all. He came down first. He always did. His hair was damp, shirt slightly wrinkled. He nodded when he saw me, eyes flicking briefly toward the cups before settling on the window. Thanks, he said, reaching for one. I offered a small smile, but it didn't reach my eyes. He sat at the table and sipped quietly. I didn't sit across from him. I stood by the counter, arms crossed, my coffee cooling in my hands. A few minutes later, my husband entered the kitchen, rubbing the back of his neck, still half asleep. He smiled at both of us, completely unaware of how brittle the air had become. Morning, he said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. I let him. We moved through breakfast like a dance we'd rehearsed too many times, plates passed, toast buttered, the news murmuring from the background. But everything was off-key. Each gesture, each word, felt like it belonged to someone else's life. My husband left first, briefcase in hand, phone already pressed to his ear. He waved as he walked out the door, distracted by whatever call he had answered. I stood in the doorway, watching his car disappear around the corner. When I turned around, he was still sitting at the table, staring into his cup. The silence that followed was different this time. Not heavy. Not thick. Just final. I picked up the dishes and began to clean, the clinking of ceramic and the splash of water the only sounds in the room. I'm leaving tomorrow, he said, his voice low. I stopped. My hand was still in the sink, the sponge pressed against the edge of a plate. I didn't turn around. Not yet. Not because of you, he added. Because I can't stay. I swallowed hard and closed my eyes for a second before setting the plate down and facing him. His expression was calm. Not angry. Not cold. Just tired. Worn. I didn't mean for it to happen, I said quietly. I know, he replied. That was all. He stood, finished the last sip of his coffee, and walked out of the kitchen. I stood alone, staring at the table. The third cup remained untouched. The rest of the day passed in pieces. I swept the hallway. I changed the sheets in the guest room. I folded towels that didn't need folding. I opened drawers and closed them again. I stood in front of mirrors and didn't recognize the face staring back. He didn't speak again that day. He worked outside, fixing the shed door like he had promised, sanding down a warped board by the garden fence. I watched from the kitchen window, unable to move. That evening, my husband called. He was staying late again, something urgent had come up. He apologized. Said he'd make it up to me. I told him not to worry. I didn't wait for him to ask how my day had been. After the call, I wandered into the backyard. The sun had already begun to set, casting everything in gold. The shadows stretched long across the grass, reaching toward the fence, the shed, the garden we had tried to build together. I stood there until the sky turned dark and the first stars appeared. When I went back inside, the house felt colder. I walked upstairs and opened the door to the guest room. It was empty. The bed was made. The suitcase was gone. On the desk sat a single folded note, written in handwriting I now knew too well. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I closed the door behind me and walked down the hallway, each step heavier than the last. In our bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the empty floor. My husband's slippers were still by the door. His book was still on the nightstand. Everything exactly as it should be. Except me. I looked down at my hands. They weren't shaking. They were still. Later, I crawled into bed and pulled the covers up to my chest. I lay there in the dark, eyes open, listening. Not for footsteps. Not for doors. But for the silence I had created. The silence I would now have to live with.